Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Saturday edition called Step Up Your Game with Dan. I'm your host, Dan Hanford, and I'll be discussing topics to help you make better decisions to increase your productivity, increase your sales, and improve your overall marketing. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HanfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HanfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD Capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HanfordCapital.com. On the podcast with us today is Mark Altman. He is the founder, speaker, and trainer for a company called MindsetGo. He's going to be talking to us today about motivational interviewing. So welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Dan, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Before we dive into this topic, I want you to kind of introduce yourself a little bit more to our listeners and kind of tell them a little bit about MindsetGo and what your purpose is and what your current focus is right now.
Sure. Dan, MindsetGo has been around for about 5 years. The name is very important. It wasn't accidental. I believe that having the right mindset and attitude is the number one determinant of your personal and professional success and happiness. So we're all about getting people to shift their mindsets, really embrace new behaviors and patterns. So, my passion, my why for doing this, Dan, is because as I've gone through my professional career, I've really been blown away when I encounter so many people who are held back by a lack of confidence in a certain area or because of fear in a certain area. And it was funny because last night, I was talking to my 12-year-old son, and he said to me, he had just met someone, a high school student. He said, "Boy, Dad, they seem really confident." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Well, they just seemed confident." And I said, that's the problem with the word confidence. You could get the most confident human being in the world, and I would still bet you a lot of money that they are still not confident in certain areas. So whether it's a CEO all the way down to a fourth grader, everybody struggles in areas of confidence. And whether it's skill development, confidence, or fear, MindsetGo is really about helping people develop in those areas.
And it's so interesting because as you're talking about that conversation you had with your son, I feel like I'm a very confident person, but there are certain people that I get around that I feel less confident around. And they make me feel like really, really small. You know what I mean? And so I think it also depends on who you are around. And like you said, like what space you are actually in, because confidence is only applicable in an area that you can feel confident in, right?
Dan, I think you hit that spot on because, it is the kind of criteria that affect your confidence, certainly your environment, certainly the people within your environment, and certainly what you said about space, which is so big, which is where your frame of mind is on that given day or that given time period in that interaction. So I think that was spot on.
So I know we're going to be talking a lot about mindset. We're talking about this motivational interviewing. I want you to first help our listeners understand, because we hear this whole mindset thing a lot. Now, in the last several years, mindset has become a kind of a mainstream topic or mainstream, subject that is being, brought up a lot. And I think there's some misunderstanding of what it means to have a proper mindset. You're really specifically referring to a mindset as it has to do with communication. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. I would say I have 3 quick points I would make about mindset, Dan. First of all, I'm really talking most about a growth mindset. And the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset for your listeners, if I was to really simply break it down, like I'm someone, Dan, who isn't good mechanically. So if I had a fixed mindset, I would say, I'm just the worst person when it comes to fixing things. And that fixed mindset really is, I'm thinking that I'm bad at something and there's no way I can get better at it. Where a growth mindset, I would say, you know what, I'm not that great at fixing things, but I still am working on getting better, or I still have the potential to get better. So there are three facets of mindset. One is having a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. The second thing is, and this is so essential, Dan, and that is using failure as a learning tool to improve. So instead of, if you fail at something, beating yourself up and dwelling on it, you say, well, you know what, I learned a heck of a lesson from that, and I'm going to use that lesson to get better. And then the most powerful mindset thing that we work on is, and this is big, Dan, it's recognizing habits, behaviors, and patterns instead of achievements. So Dan, if you just closed a new client that you just landed, and someone in the organization walks up to you and says, Dan, great job landing that new deal. Well, yeah, we do want to recognize that. But what you're really supposed to say, if you have the right mindset, is, hey, Dan, great job landing the new deal. What were the habits you used? What was the behaviors, the process you used to make that happen? Because if you're reinforcing habits, behaviors, and processes and not achievements, then you get the long-term results most organizations and human beings are looking for.
That's interesting because I call myself a seminar junkie. I love going to seminars, love going to network with people, and I go to a lot of business events as well, a lot of business seminars. And a lot of people, when they go to those business seminars, they talk to a lot of successful people, and they, talk about things that really don't, like you said, have that, growth mindset. And once they figure out, somebody who's successful in the room, they should be going to those people in that room and saying, hey, like you said, hey, what have you done to get to that point? I don't really care where you are now. It's great that you're there, but how did you get there? What was your A to Z to get to that point? And what are you doing now to get to the next level?
Yeah, I completely agree. That's great advice.
So open us up a little bit about this motivational interviewing and what that means and what you're presenting today.
Yeah, so it's interesting, Dan. In 1980, this motivational interviewing practice is virtually unknown in the business profession. It's really heavy in the medical field. And basically in 1980, a doctor did a training with 9 counselors for behavioral therapy on problem drinking. And so the idea was that people who were alcoholics couldn't stop being an alcoholic. And really, let's be honest, there's a lot of reasons when people can't change their habits. But for the purpose of today, we're going to simplify it. So why, when you can't stop your drinking, can you not change? And the reason is, that was determined from this test, this pilot program, is because everybody is always telling you why you should stop drinking and why it's bad for you. And no one's really taking the time to discover what your personal motivators would be to stop drinking. So this was a technique that was used. It worked very effectively. It's grown throughout the medical profession. A lot of doctors started to use it for getting patients to stop smoking. And my brother is the chair of Tufts Medical School. And I was talking to him one day last year, about a year ago, and I was telling him a lot of the training I do and how I train and coach clients. And he said, boy, Mark, that sounds a lot like motivational interviewing. And I said, really? And he said, why don't you come to one of my trainings and see if it is? And I did, and it was. And Dan, there's 3 fundamental pieces to motivational interviewing. Is 1, it's getting people to embrace change. 2, it's getting someone to discover their own personal motivators. And 3, it's getting people to detach from their emotions.
So embracing change, personal motivation or personal motivator. What are those personal motivators? And then embracing the emotions.
Well, detaching from the emotions.
Detaching from the emotions.
And the reason why, Dan, is because, and think of all in corporate America, think of all the opportunities where this happens, right? From a client perspective, think of all the reasons you need to embrace change, right? Maybe you're changing your pricing or policies or service standards. Maybe you have employees at the company where you're changing benefits, or again, processes within the company and things that are going to change. When it's in sales, you have it all the time. I mean, how many times, Dan, do you hear a client say, well, that's how we've always done it, or if it's not broken, don't fix it, or all the various obstacles that get in the way of sales, because people struggle with embracing change. People struggle with overcoming their fears that will have to do with that change and the assumed consequences. So in the emotion part, that's what holds people back. So motivational interviewing is getting people to actually, it sounds so counterintuitive, Dan, but it's really getting people to reach a point of ambivalence. So at least they're not so attached to their emotions.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this first step in this process of motivational interviewing. It's embracing that change.
Yep.
What would you say is some of the strategies that you would recommend for somebody to help to embrace that change or be able to kind of get to that mindset?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it all starts with something that we experience basically at birth, and that's called the writing reflex. And the writing reflex is actually spelled R-I-G-H-T, not writing something down. And the writing reflex, Dan, is about hierarchy. So for our listeners out there, think about this. You start out as a child and your parents are always telling you what to do and the right way to do it. And then you go to school and your teachers are telling you the right way to know how to do it. And then you get out in the real world and get a job and your bosses are always telling you what to do and the right way to do it. So the writing reflex, as part of the first step in motivational interviewing, it's actually not doing something. So the writing, it's the ability to avoid telling someone the right answer and telling them what to do so they immediately don't get a trigger or a reaction thinking, oh, this is another person just telling me the right way to do something. Does that make sense?
Can you give us an example?
Sure. So let's say you're dealing with someone that's chronically late for work, okay? And you get them in your manager, you get them in your office, and you say, Jim, when you're late for work, it really impacts the team productivity, and it really impacts everybody and how they perceive you and your commitment to the company. Well, that's the last thing you want to say in that situation, because then you're doing the writing reflex. So what you really want to say in a situation like that is, geez, Jim, I know you've been chronically late for work. What's been going on? Why has this been a struggle for you? And then as they kind of share why that struggle, and instead of telling them what the right thing to do, you might want to ask a question, Dan, like, well, what would motivate you to come to work on time? Or what are some things that you would value in an employee that shows up on time for work? And what's really tricky about motivational interviewing for a lot of executives to grasp and be comfortable with it is that question I just said, what would motivate you to do it? Well, there's an assumption that I don't need to ask that question. You work at this company, you have a job, you work for me.
Your motivation is to keep your job.
That's right. That's right. But the thing is, it doesn't weaken your authority. When you ask someone what would motivate you to do something, it doesn't mean you have to take what they say as gospel or you have to do whatever they say. It's just a question. But that's an example.
I'm trying to figure out, so if you're sitting down talking to this person and you're asking them that, what if they look at you and just say, I don't know?
Well, that's a good scenario because, frankly, most people will say, I don't know, because they've never thought about it. That's the idea. Yeah. So when someone says they don't know, then comes the series of questions. So, Dan, if you work for me and I said to you, all right, Dan, let's back up. Put yourself in my shoes for a second. And let's say you had someone chronically coming in late for work. How would you handle it? And why would that bother you? And would it bother you? Mm-hmm. And a big part of motivational interviewing is while you're removing the writing reflex, you're creating a sense of empowerment to the other person you're talking to so you're on the same level. And we know, Dan, in sales that we always want to be the trusted expert, right? Mm-hmm. So you're making the person in the conversation not only in the same level, but when you try to pick their brain and get their feedback on how they would personally feel and how they could see what's going on through your eyes, you're empowering them to be the trusted expert.
It's almost like it's hard to motivate somebody else, but they have to be willing to motivate themselves.
Yeah, I mean, they have to motivate themselves, but, like, for example, for me, I've been biting my nails for 25 years, and I've had so many people over the course of my career say, Mark, you really shouldn't bite your nails. People see your nails, it doesn't look good. And I know they're right, Dan. I know they're right. But by everybody telling me something I already know, that's not going to motivate me. If someone actually said to me one day, why do you think it would be important to stop biting your nails? And how do you think it impacts you adversely in your personal and professional life and so on and so forth? That's at least as a chance I might see a different perspective. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Do you really have a problem eating your nails?
I do. And Dan, I even use that, that liquid they tell you to put on there.
Yep.
but the habit's so ingrained, I can't break it.
Now you like the taste of it, probably.
Now I like the taste of it.
It's like my mom and dad when I was growing up, when I would, say something I wasn't supposed to say or whatever. They'd wash my mouth out with, they didn't use soap. They'd actually use, they tried that. And I actually liked that too. But it was like, all right, we're going to step it up and we're going to give you some jalapeno peppers. Well, I love spicy food now.
Well, and you know what? I'm going to, even though it's not business related, I'm going to give a very quick, simple, one more example that I think most of us can relate to. Assuming if you have kids, you can relate to this. So picture a 10 or 11-year-old kid or even a younger child sitting at the table, chewing with their mouth open. So what do we say as parents when we see our kids chewing with their mouth open? Hey,
Stop chewing with your mouth open.
Right. I don't want you chewing. Stop chewing with your mouth open. Right. And then presumably the kid stops in that moment, but you really haven't cured the habit. You just, out of fear, out of consequences, the person stops, but the habit probably doesn't change. And then, of course, what happens, Dan, is then if it keeps going, what do parents typically do? Then they put consequences in play. Okay. Mm-hmm. And again, that's short term. So what you would do, and if my son was at the table chewing with his mouth open, I would look at him and say, hey, Cole, do you know why I ask you to chew with your mouth closed? And of course, most kids would be like, no. As a matter of fact, most kids might even say, well, I think you're doing it just to nag me, right? And so I would say, well, let me tell you why. I love you very much. And I think what I get worried about is you're such a great kid and you have such an easy time making friends and getting along with others. It would break my heart if you got older and kids didn't want to eat with you or adults didn't want to eat with you because it was kind of gross. And then that could affect your confidence level and you might feel sad and you might interpret it as people don't like me when it's just really you're chewing with your mouth open. So
it's so interesting because I'm struggling with that right now. I got 4 kids.
Right?
I'm going to try that. I'm going to try that on them for sure.
Yeah. And part of motivational interviewing is there's a tendency when people do that, I don't know, where you just want to go right back to that writing reflex, which is, oh, I don't know, like I just did in that example. But the whole thing about motivational interviewing is you don't give up. If someone says they don't know, you say, well, think about it. Why do you think I would care about that? Why do you think I would even bring this up to you? Mm-hmm. You've got to stick with it. You have to go 2 or 3 questions deep. And my experience is as long as you stick with it and don't get impatient, 90% of the time, you will get people starting to share those motivators.
And so it sounds to me like embracing the change in that type of a motivational interviewing setting, like going back to the example of being late for work, when you are starting to talk to them about that, you're also bringing in number 2, which is finding their personal motivators.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, so the writing reflex, you're absolutely right. And so the writing reflex is the first step. The second step comes down to listening. Now, it's almost like, most people know what active listening is. The issue comes with active listening is how do you demonstrate active listening, right? So a lot of people might do it by nodding their head, taking notes, smiling, asking follow-up questions, right? There's a lot of ways. But the key to motivational interviewing is actually utilizing reflective listening in addition to active listening, because for those viewers or listeners who don't know what that is, reflective listening is repeating back what you just heard for clarification. So if I'm trying to get someone, let's say there's an employee who doesn't really like his job responsibilities. And I say to that employee, what is it that you're struggling with in your job responsibilities? And he says, well, I just don't like working on such and such project. And then I repeat back. So I just want to clarify that your biggest concern is that you don't like working on such and such project. Well, some people can think that's condescending. But the whole point of reflective listening and communication is you win either way. Either you're correct in what you repeat back and the person feels validated in that you were listening, or you're incorrect and then you give the person a chance to correct you so you've understood it. So either way, that second piece of reflective listening is critical.
Well, and I think even sometimes when you have that reflective listening and you're repeating back for clarification, a lot of times when that other person hears what they are saying, they think about it even more going, that's what I said, And it kind of, when one of the things that we implemented in our office is when people would have a complaint about a system or a process, we would have them write it down. Because a lot of times when you actually listen to yourself or write something down, it's like, really? Like, what am I thinking about? Because it kind
Yep.
of makes them think about themselves and what they're actually saying.
Well, I love that, Dan. I love that you do that with your office. It speaks to some of your core values. And I think that, one of the critical things, if I was to say, if you're about to sit down and practice motivational interviewing with somebody else as the interviewer, so to speak, let's go back to the mindset and what you were just talking about. So the first thing on the mindset is you have to have a curiosity mindset, because a lot of us, when we're communicating with others, there's patterns of communication that happen with other human beings, and that we assume someone's going to react a certain way, or we assume we know what someone else is thinking. And so by having a curious mindset, it really creates a culture of mindfulness. So you're present and you're aware of what you are thinking, what you're saying, and how you are reacting to what the other person is saying. So when you say that you have your staff write down the complaint, you're asking them to be, that's a form of mindfulness, where you're asking them to do that. So I think having a curiosity mindset, having an optimistic mindset, which is going in thinking, hey, I'm not going to let my confidence that this will work be based on my previous experiences with this person. And then, of course, going hand in hand with optimism is belief, and belief that no matter how they're reacting, you can still get it done.
So somebody comes into the office, they are consistently late for work. You're talking to them about embracing that change and those personal motivators of, trying to figure out what can be motivating to them to get them to actually show up for work on time, kind of shifting the roles a little bit, kind of getting them thinking about you and your position and how it looks from the outside. And then how does this detaching emotions kind of play in here?
So the detaching emotions really comes from the third step, which is something called effortless empathy. So what's funny about motivational interviewing is that most times when you have a conversation, especially in a corporate environment, you're very purpose-driven and focused. And what's tricky about motivational interviewing is it's actually encouraged to go off topic. So the difference between standard empathy and effortless empathy is, Dan, if you just told me your dog died and I say back to you, oh, geez, Dan, I've had a dog that's died too. That's rough, boy. I'm really sorry to hear that. Well, that's your standard empathy. Effortless empathy is the ability throughout your entire conversation to look for spots and opportunities to be empathetic. Okay, so for instance, to the person who's chronically late, oh, well, geez, there was so much traffic today, or, oh, I was really sick last night and couldn't sleep, or whatever the standard excuses people give. And so that's an opportunity where you look at the person, you say, geez, that must be tough. Yeah, boy, I got to tell you, I've sat in traffic a whole bunch of times as well. And again, like I said earlier in our conversation today, there's this perception that by validating someone else's opinion or by empathizing with their plight, it means you've gone soft or you agree with the excuse or what they're saying. And that's not what it means at all. By being effortlessly empathetic throughout, you are distracting them from their emotions, because now you've removed the hierarchy, you've distracted the emotions, and now you're forming a human connection with them and getting on their same level. So the idea is not only to use effortless empathy, but this is where the skill also, Dan, comes in of storytelling, where you have the ability in this moment, while you're being empathetic to the other person, to share a story and become vulnerable that makes them kind of relate to you and say, wow, this person really has my best interests at heart, and I can start to trust. So that's how we do it.
Well, and I'm going to be open and frank with you that this is very hard for me, this whole motivational interviewing piece, because I have been in that situation where I've had people that have shown up late for work, and it's chronic late for work. It's not like a one-time thing. Every once in a while, people are late for work, and you understand, you just kind of move on. But I've had people who, like you're talking about, like we've talked about this topic of being late for work. And of course, this is how my process would go. Now, I know I'm going to ask you a question after this. So my process is usually like most people at this point, where, you bring the person in, you're like, why are you late for work? This has been like 3 times a week for the last 4 weeks, and I don't know what's going on, but you keep on telling me it's the traffic. But if it's the traffic, then you need to leave your house early enough, and I'm not sure what's going on at home, but you got to fix that or else.
Yep.
And so how do you get from going from that, I guess, mindset or process to training yourself? Because it's really a process of training and skill building of being able to do this motivational interviewing so that even if that person is late for work, you can put this into place and so you don't lose a good person.
Well, it's a great example you're giving. And to be honest, our foundational training we do is emotional intelligence, because what you're talking about is to succeed in sales, in management, in service, you have to have a level of emotional intelligence. And that really requires a lot of self-awareness, like what you were just alluding to. Now, in the scenario you gave, Dan, the environment you create in having these conversations is important. And there's a couple of examples I always give. So if I'm calling you into my office for chronically being late, the first thing that's going to happen is I'm already going to have my defenses and radar up, because I'm going to wonder why you're talking to me out of a normal interaction we would normally have. When you get called into someone's office and they close the door behind you, immediately defenses are going up. So when you start out a conversation, man, we keep having to talk about this. Why is this happening? Right when you go into that mode, you've lost any opportunity to get honest answers and motivators, because you've already put them in a defensive mode. And the funny thing is, Dan, one of my favorite topics is accountability. And you know why so many people make excuses in the world? It's because all the conversations start with, why did that happen? So that's why we're in a culture of excuses, because the question leading in is eliciting an excuse. And I'll give you a very brief example. I was working with a bank a couple of months ago, and there was an incident where someone walked into the bank. Actually, this was probably several months ago, because it was in the wintertime, now that I think about it. So someone walked into the bank. They were called into work in the middle of a snowstorm. The woman was pregnant, and they ended up not even being able to open, and she drove all the way in this snowstorm pregnant. So she walked in the bank amongst the other employees and dropped an F word and said, "This effing stinks." And so what happens? So the manager calls her into her office and says, "Hey, you can't be doing that. That's not acceptable here at this bank." And of course, she knows that. Don't tell me something I already know. I know most people know when they did something wrong, so they don't need to be reminded. We know why she did it, because she was frustrated, but we also need her to think about other alternatives or options she could have had in that moment to deal with that situation. Instead of telling her what other options are, we need her to say what they were.
So basically asking her, what could you have done differently?
Yeah, exactly. So first, it's understanding where the frustration evolved from, because frankly, in a lot of cases, Dan, the frustration might not have just evolved from driving in the snow. This could have been a buildup of frustrations that just put somebody over the top. So it's, where do the frustrations evolve from? What could you have done differently? Why do you think this would be a bad thing to do in front of the other employees? Why do you think this could reflect poorly on you when you're getting reviews and you have aspirations for a promotion? And two of the fundamental concepts, Dan, of motivational interviewing are, the interviewer themselves does not get to make statements. They have to only ask questions. And the only time they're really allowed to make statements is when they're giving an anecdote or a story around empathy. But not only can you not make statements, the end of the motivational interview, you actually have to ask the other person permission for next steps. So for example, if you're that chronically late person, at the end of the interview, let's say we've had a good conversation, and let's say the other person says, "All right, yeah, now I've recognized why this is a problem. Let me think about some things I could do differently to ensure this happens again." And then I, as the interviewer, look at that person and go, "All right, Dan, would it be okay if we reconnect next Wednesday to kind of go over any thoughts you've had and maybe put a new process in place to make sure it doesn't happen again? Would that be okay with you?" And then, of course, they'll hopefully say yes. Now, if the person says no, for the manager who says to me, "What if they say no, it's not okay?" Then I go right back into motivational interviewing mode and I say, "All right, well, if you're not okay with revisiting, then how are we going to solve the problem?"
So you mentioned two fundamentals. Like the first one I got, which was interviewer is only asking questions. What was the second one?
The second one is asking permission for the follow-up steps in the close of the discussion. It's asking permission to explore what happens next in the follow-up steps.
Okay. In your experience, what has been the biggest factors that, hold somebody back from implementing something like this into their business or their sales team or the like?
Well, it's absolutely fear. And, we're driven by fear. And I think, when I first heard your podcast and how powerful it was, that was for me and, being in one of my responsibilities being in sales, there's so much frustration when people don't respond to our emails and don't follow up after appointments and don't return our phone calls. And there's constant rejection in sales. So when you're feeling rejected and, how do you stay resilient when you're rejected? How do you overcome your fears so that rejection doesn't keep happening to you? So, and I think of client interactions all the time. We're taught traditionally in sales to do probing. And motivational interviewing to me is probing on steroids. And I think it's just a different level of probing. It's just really being open to the personal connection. Because Dan, so much in sales to me is the person you're interacting with in many cases, or the multiple people you're interacting with, they're not just thinking of how it's going to impact the company. They're also in many cases thinking of how it's going to impact them personally, right? And does this decision reflect well on me? Am I sticking my neck out and going to regret that I did? So when you discover someone's personal motivators and not just their company motivators, it's a game changer. And I think understanding someone's fear and what keeps them up at night, it's everything.
Well, I can see that this motivational interviewing can be applied in so many different areas. I mean, we talked already about, our family relationships, personal relationships, business relationships. It encompasses so many different areas. And, even you said earlier about your brother with, smoking cessation and stuff like that. This can help with so many different areas, even weight loss and, diabetes and so many other areas and ailments. I think this is a very unique topic that I think needs to be brought up more and more, because I think the more we can talk about some of these personal motivators and detaching from emotions and really trying to embrace that change is really important. How can the listeners get more information about this topic from you, or maybe jump on a call with you, or try to set something up with you to maybe go through this a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, Dan, for me, the reason why I'm trying to bring motivational interviewing for business is because, how can I differentiate relative to what other companies do? And, people can hire for sales training and leadership training and team building and engagement, all those things, but it all comes down to your communication skills and how you interact with other people. And so if you're at a company and you're sitting there going, geez, what does this guy do? How could he help us? If you have any kind of challenge in the area of communication related to the typical things companies need to outsource, give me a call. My number is 978-793-1159. MindsetGo is one word, and you could reach me. It's maltman@mindsetgo.com. And listen, a conversation never hurts. If there's something you think this could be helpful to you personally or your organization, give me a shout. Let's have a chat and see if there's any opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for taking some time out of your schedule to be with us today on the podcast. I learned a lot, and I know our listeners did as well, and look forward to having you on a future episode in the future.
Yeah, Dan, I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you so much for educating the masses. I think this podcast you do is so valuable.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. And for those listeners, we will also have links to his contact information as well as his website and various things like that. So if you're driving or working out or whatever, just go to the show notes at toughdecisions.net, and we'll make sure that you have all those links. Thank you so much again, Mark.
All right, Dan, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email, where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.